Hello, welcome to another short video lesson to give you a little background for 1st and 2nd Corinthians that you'll be studying this week. Now, specifically the book of 1st Corinthians. It's unlike a lot of Paul's books, mainly because of the length, but also because of what he deals with. For instance, what is the main topic of 1st Corinthians? Well, it's not any one specific thing because he deals with so many different issues. If there's an actual theme, we'd have to say that it's correction and rebuke, because he's correcting and rebuking the Corinthians. Though they are believers, they're carnal. He calls them carnal and fleshly. And so he deals with divisions, he deals with immorality, he deals with misuse or of the observance of the Lord's Supper, issues with marriage, and then finally he concludes with the doctrine of the resurrection. And that's what all of chapter 15 is about. So think about this. The doctrine of the resurrection. It's what some people call a progressive revelation found in Scripture. Now, that doesn't mean that the doctrine of the resurrection is not in the Old Testament. It's there, but it's not as direct and as open, I should say, as you find in the New Testament. For instance, is the doctrine of the resurrection found in the Old Testament at all? Yes, but it's always implied. For instance, Job made references. He said, though the skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Well, what is that but a resurrection? If after he's dead and the body's decomposed, yet in that same flesh he'll see God, then he must be talking about a resurrection. He said in another place, I know that my Redeemer liveth, at the latter day he shall stand upon the earth. Speaking of Jesus, which would have to be after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Again, the doctrine of the resurrection is in the Old Testament, but it's never real plain until we come to the New Testament. And this is what some people call, as I said earlier, progressive revelation. As the Scriptures were given, then more on a particular subject might be given and revealed by the Spirit of God, as he did to the Apostle Paul, for instance, with this particular doctrine. So Paul is writing to these carnal, selfish, divided, immoral people who have some other problems. And as he's correcting them, he's telling them in one place, you can't stand the strong meat of the Word. Then you get to chapter 15, and what does he deal with? All 58 verses are on the doctrine of the resurrection. So to those whom he has called spiritually immature and babies, now he dumps enough spiritual doctrine on them to choke a horse, the doctrine of the resurrection. Why does he do that? Well, because the doctrine of the resurrection has been called into question. There were those who were saying there is no resurrection, or the resurrection is already past. And so Paul then begins to build a case for the resurrection based upon his rabbinical training, such as being very systematic, and it's almost like reading a lawyer's brief as he begins to give arguments for the resurrection. And he talks about why there has to be a resurrection, because we have to be resurrected and rewarded as God's children for the work we've done. And if there be no resurrection, then all is vain. But really, the best reason for the resurrection given in 1 Corinthians 15 is one that's very subtle, but yet it comes out plain in verse 58. The last verse, after he's given all 57 verses on the strongest, most open teaching on the doctrine of the resurrection, he concludes and says, therefore, my beloved brethren. Now, anytime you see a therefore, you need to look and see what it's there for, because there's a purpose for it. So he's pointing you back to the previous 57 verses and saying, therefore, or in light of all that I've just said, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. What he was saying was, God has promised a resurrection. And if for no other reason, there will be a resurrection because God said it and God doesn't lie and he always keeps his word. So therefore, my beloved brethren, as God is steadfast and unmovable and always keeps his word, then you be steadfast and unmovable in serving God, being faithful to him, because one day he will resurrect you and he will reward you simply because he said he would do it based upon his word. So hang in there. Continue. Be steadfast, unmovable in your studies in New Testament Survey online.